I wish I could say I uncovered my wife's betrayal in some dramatic, movie-like fashion, but honestly, it was more like a cringeworthy scene from a cheap paperback. I work at an auto parts plant assembling brakes. It's not glamorous by any means, but it pays the bills. I've always thought I was lucky enough. Steady work from 4 p.m. to midnight, 5 days a week. Sure, it's repetitive, but I meet my quota, stay out of trouble, and sometimes land a bonus at year-end. After 12 years of marriage to my wife, Lydia, and with 2 young boys in elementary school, I'd thought life was pretty solid. We live in a comfortable little 3-bedroom house, and I figured things were on a good track. That was until today. The factory has 5 stations dedicated to assembling brake shoes, all powered by compressed air. In the 8 years I've been on the line, we've never had a major issue, but today, right in the middle of my shift, the whole compressed air system failed. The air has to be totally dry, filtered, and free from moisture, or it messes everything up. Normally, a dehydrator handles this, but today it malfunctioned, and moisture snuck in. I'm no mechanic, but I do know that when moisture gets mixed with high-pressure air, it freezes things up fast. And just like that, work came to a standstill. They sent us all home without pay, saying it was unavoidable. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. My whole life was about to derail because of a little humidity. I got home much earlier than usual and headed straight for the bedroom. As soon as I opened the door, I was greeted by the sight of some stranger. A hairy guy, moving on top of Lydia. Without thinking, I flicked on the overhead light. Lydia wasn't asleep or caught off guard. She shot me an annoyed glare and actually had the nerve to ask why I was there, as if I was the one in the wrong. I'd expected shock, maybe regret, something like that, but she just looked furious. When I asked why she was angry, she snapped, claiming I should know exactly what was going on. She admitted she regretted I had to see it, but then had the audacity to say it was my fault for not being home at my usual time. According to her, if I'd been on schedule, none of this would have happened. The guy finally sat up from the bed, revealing his face with a cocky smirk, like he'd won some kind of twisted prize. Lydia half-heartedly pulled the covers up around herself, as if pretending to care about modesty at that point even mattered. I made the mistake of lunging at the guy as he got off the bed. Standing up, he turned out to be a lot bigger than I'd expected. I barely even swung before he nailed me hard. 2 blows to the ribs, and I was down on the floor, gasping for air. I took one more hit to the side of my head before everything went black. When I came to, I was lying in a hospital bed, ribs tightly bandaged. A medical tech was working nearby, and Lydia was standing off to the side, arms crossed, looking absolutely disgusted. As soon as the tech stepped out, I asked her the question burning in my mind. Who was that guy, and why was he in our house? Dominic's a friend, she said casually, like this was just any other conversation. I invited him over. A friend? You were with him in our bed, with the kids just down the hall. I could barely believe her nerve. Yeah, I know, she replied, totally unfazed. If you hadn't made a scene, they wouldn't have woken up. I took a breath, trying to process. What was he doing here? How long has this been going on? She sighed, annoyed. How many times are you going to ask? Dominic and I have been together for about 6 months. We've kept it quiet so you wouldn't find out. Normally, he doesn't come here, but I couldn't get a sitter this time. So, it's over then? She rolled her eyes. No, Nate, it's not over. You're a good dad and all, but Dominic's great in bed. I don't see why we should end it just because you caught us. But fine, I promise we won't meet here anymore. It's not fair to you or the kids. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Lydia, this isn't right. It ends now. Her face hardened. Nate, if you try to interfere with my relationship with Dominic, you'll regret it. He's not afraid to put you in your place again, and trust me, he will. If you push this, everyone will know what a failure you are. Our friends, your family, even the people at work. You don't want that, do you? My chest tightened. You'd really do that to me? Go that low just to keep him around? She didn't even blink. If I have to, yes. Dominic thinks you're a loser, and I agree. You'll just have to live with it. Who is this guy anyway? I asked. Where does he work? Oh, he doesn't work exactly. He owns Continental Classics, that luxury car place on Lancaster Pike. You know, the one you always talked about visiting but never did. He's richer, smarter, better in bed, and definitely tougher than you. Why do you think I'm with him? Then why don't you marry him, if he's so perfect? She shook her head with a laugh. Oh, honey, that's where you come in. Dominic doesn't want kids, and I'm not giving mine up. So you'll stick around, play the family man, while he and I have our time together. Either you accept it, or everyone will know just how pathetic you really are. She paused, smirking. And by the way, I've moved your things to the guest room. No need to share a bed now that the truth is out there. I barely held my composure. Who's been watching the kids while you've been sneaking around with him? Oh, usually Rachel. Sometimes your parents. She smirked. Rachel's actually the one who introduced me to Dominic. I owe her a thank you. The next morning, the hospital finally discharged me, but Lydia didn't bother to show up. I considered calling someone for a ride, but eventually just took a taxi home. Once I got back, with the kids at school and Lydia nowhere to be found, I went upstairs to find all my clothes and belongings dumped in the guest room. The sight of it made my stomach turn. I knew Logan and Mason might have questions, but I decided I'd let Lydia handle that when the time came. Setting up my new room took less than an hour. As I unpacked, thoughts raced through my head. There was no way I was letting her get away with this. My first move was to dig out an old phone recorder I kept in the basement. It only worked with our landline, but it was something. Lydia used her cell for most calls, but I figured any proof I could gather was worth it. I hid the recorder behind a stack of paint cans and set it up. Still aching from the night before, I dragged myself back to work that afternoon. They offered me pain pills, but I turned them down. I wasn't about to risk mixing those with machinery, no matter how much I was hurting. A couple of heavy-duty Tylenols seemed like a better plan. Lydia really didn't understand how close I was with my coworkers, and I didn't hold back. I told them everything. The guys rallied around me right away, each throwing out suggestions, some serious, some pretty out there. Still, it felt good to know they had my back. With a full shift ahead of us, we all agreed to brainstorm during our supper break. When the break finally came, Grant kicked things off. Any ideas? He asked, leaning in. I don't have a solid plan yet, but my cousin works for Santoro, he said, referring to Dominic's business. He does detailing for their cars and hates the guy. He could probably give us some inside info on his schedule or when he's alone at the shop. Hey, that could be helpful, Grant. Thanks, I nodded, already feeling like we were getting somewhere. Jared chimed in next. I've got 2 old muskets and a couple of pistols, he offered with a grin. None of them are registered, so they're yours if you need them. Thanks, Jared, I said, laughing. But I don't think I'm looking to go that extreme just yet. Leo's eyes sparkled as he leaned in. Oh, you don't even want to hear my idea, he smirked, and the group erupted into laughter. But everyone pressed him to spill it. All right, he grinned. I say we tie him to a tree, spread his legs, and build a bonfire between them old school style. Laughter filled the room, and though we all chuckled, the idea was shot down pretty fast. That's when Ethan, who'd been quiet, cleared his throat. Okay, don't look at me like that. But yeah, I've got an idea. It's unconventional. Go on, Ethan, I encouraged him, curious. I read about this prison in Arizona, he started, where they make sex offenders wear pink jumpsuits to humiliate them. Now, obviously Dominic isn't a sex offender, but maybe we could do something similar. Really embarrass him? What, like put him in a pink jumpsuit? Someone snickered. Not quite, Ethan continued, thinking it through. I was thinking we could tie him up and spray paint him head to toe in bright pink. That way, he has to walk around looking ridiculous until he scrubs it all off. That might work, but he'd know who did it. We'd have to knock him out first, then leave him tied up somewhere out in the open, someone pointed out. Ethan shrugged. I could probably get my hands on a taser. Just sneak up and zap him. You make it sound way easier than it is. I laughed, thinking about Dominic's build. How do we even get close to him without him noticing? Ethan raised his hands in surrender. Hey, just throwing ideas out there. The buzzer signaled it was time to get back to work, so we all headed back to the machines. My quota was down that night, but the guys chipped in to help, and by the end of the shift, I'd gotten through. When I got home, Lydia was already in bed, actually sticking to her word not to bring Dominic around. But even lying in my makeshift guest room, I was stuck. Most of the guy's ideas were high school pranks at best, stuff like leaving a flaming bag of dog poop on Dominic's porch. What I wanted was something real, something that would hit him where it hurt. The next day, after dropping the kids at school, I watched Lydia as she moved around the house, wondering if there was something I could do right under her nose. I knew I couldn't just let things slide. I showered, shaved, and headed for the door, hoping to make it out without another one of Lydia's digs. "Morning, husband." "No goodbye kiss," she smirked, scrubbing a dish at the sink. I didn't even acknowledge her, just walked out. I needed to clear my head, get something decent to eat, and, most of all, come up with a plan to deal with Dominic that wouldn't create even more problems for me. With another shift starting soon, I couldn't afford to lose focus. From that day forward, I decided I wasn't eating at home anymore, even if it meant missing out on meals with the boys. I couldn't stand the thought of Lydia's cooking. Things at work were normal enough until supper break, when Adrian proudly mentioned that he had a taser in his car for self-protection. "Don't forget to grab it if you're interested," he said with a grin, raising his brows. "Ever used one before?" I admitted I hadn't, and the guys immediately groaned, saying we could try it out on Dominic. Although none of us had any solid ideas yet, their support lifted my spirits a bit. At home, my routine stayed the same, even though working the graveyard shift had my sleep completely out of whack. Logan and Mason were excitedly begging me to take them to Chuck E. Cheese soon, which Lydia was more than happy about. It meant she'd have the house to herself all day. That's when she dropped her latest bombshell. "Oh, and Nate," she said casually, "I'll need you to take a few vacation days next week. Dominic's friend Wally is coming in from Detroit, and we're all planning to go on a cruise to Cancun." I stared at her, my jaw nearly dropping. "Seriously, Lydia? You want me to take time off work so you can run off on a cruise with two guys?" She shot back with that same indifference. "It's not like that. Wally's going to be sharing a room with Rachel. They've been friends forever." "Oh, well, that makes it sound so much better," I replied sarcastically, making a mental note to send Rachel my thanks later. The next morning, before Chuck E. Cheese opened, I took the boys over to Hobby Lobby. They were just old enough to be fascinated by all the model kits, so I let them each pick one. Logan chose a monster truck kit, and Mason went for a tugboat. While they wandered around, I browsed the aisles, marveling at all the crafts and supplies. Part of me wondered if maybe, just maybe, Lydia wouldn't have felt the need to bring home that hairy gorilla if she'd ever gotten into a hobby instead. Too late now. Then, in one of the paint aisles, I saw them. 6 cans of designer spray paint in a stunning shade of bright pink. I'd never seen anything like it at Lowe's or Home Depot, and a wicked little voice in my head told me it was a sign. I grabbed all 6 cans without a second thought. I also picked up a pack of 10 sturdy 18-inch cable wraps, figuring they'd come in handy if any of our plans needed a creative twist. When Chuck E. Cheese opened, I let the boys go all out. 4 hours and 2 pizzas later, they were finally worn out. We wrapped up the day by feeding the ducks in the park with some cheap bread and then headed to my parents' house, where Mom and Dad were thrilled to have us for supper. Logan and Mason spent most of the evening watching TV while Dad and I talked. I finally filled him in on the mess with Lydia, the way she'd been throwing out threats. It felt good to tell someone close to me, and the more I talked about it, the less power her threats seemed to hold. Dad just nodded, a look of quiet determination on his face. "Don't worry, son," he said finally. "We'll figure this out together." Spending the night at my parents' house with the boys eased my mind a bit. Around 9 o'clock, I tried calling Lydia to let her know we'd be staying over, but it just went to voicemail. After a big breakfast at IHOP the next morning, we headed back home and found Lydia still in bed. Deciding to keep the boys occupied, I got the mower out, and they started working on their model kits outside. The weather was perfect, so I decided to make a full day of it. Mowing, edging, pruning, anything to stay busy. I ended up chatting with a few neighbors as I worked, which slowed me down, but I didn't mind. At one point, I borrowed a set of hedge clippers from Samuel Harrington across the street. His wife, Evelyn, was known as the neighborhood gossip, so I took the chance to let them know they might see some unfamiliar cars around our house. If any of Lydia's friends get rowdy while I'm working nights, I said, don't hesitate to call the cops. Victor Morgan from the local church board also stopped by and lent me a spark plug wrench. I apologized for Lydia's recent behavior, and Victor, who was an even bigger gossip than Evelyn, eagerly soaked it up. 10 minutes with him, and I knew he'd have more than enough to fuel the rumor mill for weeks. By the time I finished up the yard work around 4 o'clock, I realized I'd completely skipped lunch. After a quick shower, I decided to treat myself to something special and headed over to Rosie's Cantina. I ordered the priciest dish on the menu, didn't even know what it was exactly, but it was delicious. Later that evening, I spent time at my brother Dave's place, feeling a bit lighter for the first time in days. Dad had already filled him in on the whole situation, so I didn't need to explain much. I ended up crashing on his couch that night. Lydia's whole plan had been to scare me into accepting her affair by threatening to tell everyone I was some pathetic cuckold if I didn't play along. What she didn't expect was for me to get ahead of her and tell everyone first. Within the week, I'd talked to just about everyone around town. I wasn't just protecting myself. I was making sure she couldn't hurt me with the truth. And in the process, I painted her as the cheating schemer she was. The next day, I swung by the house to change before work. Lydia was waiting for me, visibly fuming. Rachel told me that there are rumors going around the neighborhood about me running a brothel, she hissed, glaring at me. I tried to keep my cool. I only told a few neighbors to expect male visitors at night. Figured it'd save them the shock if they heard anything. She looked ready to explode. This is getting out of hand. Who else have you told? Pretty much everyone, actually, I admitted, shrugging. It just seemed simpler that way. But don't worry. I didn't say anything to your parents or sisters. I thought you'd want to handle that before they hear it through the grapevine. Her face fell, clearly realizing how far the rumors had spread. This isn't fair, she muttered, sounding more vulnerable than I'd seen her in a while. People are going to think I'm something I'm not. I held her gaze, feeling a surge of frustration. And what about me, Lydia? You think this is fair to me? You left me looking like a fool in front of everyone we know. She mumbled an apology, though I could tell it was half-hearted. Then, glancing at her watch, she mentioned she had to leave for work and started gathering her things. I encouraged Lydia to spend a little time with the boys before she left, but it wasn't the quality time she had in mind. That evening, Grant shared the final piece of our plan. Continental Classics closed early on Thursdays, usually by 9 p.m., so Dominic could handle payroll for Friday morning. He was obsessive about being left alone while doing payroll, meaning even the cleaning crew was gone. Ethan took a few minutes to walk me through using the taser. No one was brave enough to be the test subject, but with the plan nearly set, I didn't care. I was prepared for the possibility of getting caught and maybe even arrested. But if I did, I'd make sure every news outlet got the story. The publicity would be enough to humiliate Dominic or at least rattle him enough to make some mistakes. For the next few days, I was barely home. I only went back to sleep, shower, and grab a change of clothes. By Thursday, I'd made sure my truck wouldn't start, setting it up with a dead battery so Ethan could conveniently offer me a ride. With any luck, it would all come together smoothly. At 8:30 p.m., I slipped out of work, and the guys covered for me as planned. In our aprons, gloves, and goggles, we all looked similar enough that nobody paid much attention. Bathroom breaks were common, so my absence wouldn't be noticed as long as it was quick. Once outside, I slipped into Continental Classics through the back staff entrance and headed straight to the restroom, hiding there until 9 o'clock when the last employee left and someone cut the lights. With latex gloves on, I stepped out of the restroom, moving quietly through the dim office area. Dominic's desk faced the showroom, his back turned to the door. He was absorbed in his work, pecking away on an old-school adding machine. I crept up behind him, taser in hand, and zapped him at the base of his neck. His body jerked upright, and when he started to turn, I gave him another jolt. He twitched and then slumped back, perfectly still. I worked quickly, securing 2 heavy-duty cable wraps on each arm and leg to keep him anchored to his chair. then used an old necktie I'd brought along as a blindfold. I wheeled his chair over to the showroom window, positioning him so that he'd be fully visible to everyone who showed up for work the next morning. I shook up the first can of pink spray paint and went to work, layering it across his clothes, face, and hair. The paint absorbed faster than I expected, and I ended up using all 6 cans to get the bright, shocking pink effect I'd envisioned. Dominic sat motionless, a striking pink figure glowing faintly under the dim office lights. I couldn't resist a small, satisfied smile as I surveyed the scene. Carefully packing up the empty cans and my gear, I half expected him to wake up at some point, but he stayed limp and oblivious. I considered pulling off the blindfold before leaving, but a glance at my watch reminded me I was on a tight schedule. I wanted him to wake up, confused and humiliated, only when his staff arrived. 5 minutes later, I slipped out the way I'd come, heading home for a night's rest with an unusual sense of calm. My pulse raced. I pressed my fingers to Dominic's wrist but couldn't feel a thing. Figuring the latex gloves were dulling my sense of touch, I took one off and tried again. Still nothing. Desperately, I checked his neck like they do on TV, but there was no pulse there either. My mind whirled. To be absolutely sure, I lifted a pencil tipped to his eye, touching his pupil, and when there was no reflex, my stomach dropped. Panic took over, but I forced myself to stay calm and focus. I wiped down every surface I might have touched, pocketed the necktie, and carefully cut through the plastic ties securing his arms and legs. The pink paint had left faint lines where the ties had been, giving his skin a weird, striped look. He looked like some kind of pink raccoon. Making sure I'd covered my tracks, I hurried out, trying to suppress my pounding heart. On the way back to work, I tossed all the evidence, including the taser, into a storm drain. 10 minutes later, I slipped back into the shop, blending in with everyone else on the floor. By the end of the shift, I shared what had happened with the guys, who were all accomplices in some way or another, so I trusted no one would talk. They were stunned, but none of them seemed too shaken. Leo just let out a low whistle, and Ethan, who drove me home, made a point of noting the exact time he dropped me off. Sleep didn't come easy, and by 10 a.m., Lydia burst into my room, her voice shrill. "What did you do, you idiot?" she spat. Groggy, I rolled over and met her furious glare. "What are you talking about?" "Dominic's dead," she shouted. "Rachel just called and said they found him in his office this morning. Dead. And I know you had something to do with it." She was relentless, calling me an idiot twice in the span of 5 minutes, but I just stared at her, still processing. Not wanting to deal with her wrath just yet, I dragged myself to the bathroom, taking a long, hot shower, trying to gather my thoughts. I even splashed on some aftershave, hoping the scent might irritate her. When I finally emerged and made my way to the kitchen, I froze. A tall man in a dark suit, with a stern look and close-cropped hair, was standing in the living room, talking to Lydia. I grabbed a cup of coffee, avoiding eye contact, but Lydia shot me a sarcastic smirk as I sat down in my recliner. The man approached, introducing himself as if he belonged there. "Mr. Collins, I'm Detective Marcus Hale. I'm here about the death of Anthony Santoro last night. Your wife mentioned that you had a recent altercation with Mr. Santoro, and I was hoping to ask you a few questions." "Sure, no problem," I replied, setting my coffee down. "But not here." Detective Hale raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? If you want to talk, we'll do it in your office, not in my home." "That okay with you?" I asked, catching the flicker of disappointment on Lydia's face. Clearly, she'd hoped to witness the interrogation firsthand. "Your car or mine, Mr. Collins?" the detective replied. "I'll take mine," I said. "I've got errands to run after." I put on my shoes, ignoring Lydia's fury. As I dumped my unfinished coffee in the sink, I shot her a smirk. "Looks like you're getting exactly what you wanted, sweetheart." "What are you talking about, Nate?" she snapped, but I didn't stick around to explain. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from Detective Hale on the second floor of the municipal building, in room 26, just as he'd directed. For the next hour, he grilled me on my relationship with Dominic, carefully touching on the affair without being too blunt. I was honest and gave straightforward answers, even admitting I had a motive. But I made it clear that I hadn't had the opportunity to act on it. The most surprising part was learning that Dominic had actually died from a heart issue. He'd had a pacemaker put in a few years back, and apparently the taser had interfered with it in a way no one had anticipated. They figured out some sort of struggle had been involved from the marks on his neck. I felt a strange mix of remorse and relief hearing that. Detective Hale gave me the standard "don't leave town" speech, saying he'd follow up once he verified my alibi. Surprisingly, I sensed he might even be a little sympathetic. I left on good terms, which, oddly enough, was comforting. Afterward, I grabbed a quick bite and watched the local news. They ran a segment about Dominic's death, describing him as a prominent businessman. He had no family in town, which only added to the surreal feeling. Afterward, I withdrew some cash from our bank account, then treated myself to a nice breakfast. There were things to take care of at home, and I knew this was my chance to start setting things right. When I got back, the house was empty, so I moved my belongings into the master bedroom and piled Lydia's things onto the guest room bed. I wasn't about to let her keep the room I'd worked hard for, especially now. Checking the old phone recorder in the basement, I found it had captured nothing of interest, so I gathered up important documents, banking info, insurance papers, and stashed them in a folder under my truck's front seat. Lydia's Volvo was still in my name, which made things even easier to manage. I called work and took a couple of vacation days to sort things out, and a few hours later, Lydia finally walked in, surprised to find me there. I knew this was the moment to set some boundaries, so I gave her a grin as I led her down the hall to the guest room. "What's going on?" she demanded, her tone defiant. "Who do you think you are?" I just looked at her, calm but firm. "I'll be using the master bedroom from now on. This is your room. Start putting your things away, and anything left out by dinner will be thrown away. Got any questions?" Her face twisted with frustration. "I can't fit all my things in that tiny closet. And what do you mean, thrown away?" "I mean, if it doesn't fit in here, it doesn't stay. You've got till dinner." I left her standing there, stunned, as I walked back down the hall. I stood my ground as Lydia argued about the closet space, telling her plainly, if it doesn't fit in the closet or dresser, you don't need it. This isn't up for debate. Her face twisted in anger. "Nate, you're in serious trouble. Get your act together. If you need clarification, ask later, idiot." That made 3 times in a day she'd called me an idiot. I figured I must be making some kind of progress. While she was fuming and reorganizing in the guest room, I went to work on a little plan of my own. I emptied her purse on the kitchen table, taking her cell phone, car keys, driver's license, credit cards, debit cards, and all the cash she had, leaving everything else. I grabbed her car's title from my truck, drove her Volvo to a friend's car lot across town, and sold it outright at a fair price. My friend agreed to sell it wholesale out of town. After clearing the loan, I pocketed a few thousand, then grabbed lunch at Taco Bell. Right as I was settling in with my order, my phone rang. "You bastard!" Lydia screamed on the other end. "Where's my cell phone and my car?" I chuckled to myself, glad she was using the house phone. That meant the recorder was working. "I'm sorry, honey," I replied calmly. "I needed money to hire a lawyer for the homicide charges. Once I'm out of jail, I promise I'll get you a new car." Then I hung up and turned off my cell, chuckling. That conversation made one thing clear. I needed a real lawyer. No matter how things turned out, I wasn't staying married to Lydia. Back at home, I headed straight to spend time with my boys, ignoring Lydia's glare as she tried to give me the silent treatment. The boys were eager to show me their model projects, and I listened, fascinated, while Lydia begrudgingly started on dinner. Wandering over to the guest room, I found that she'd moved her things back to the master bedroom and dumped mine back onto the bed. I chuckled, realizing she was stubborn to the core, but let it go for now. As she finished preparing dinner, I got the boys ready, and we headed out for a treat at Red Lobster. Money wasn't an issue. I still had cash even after the lawyer's deposit. The shrimp and lobster combo hit the spot, and I couldn't resist those famous cheese rolls. I turned my cell back on afterward, hoping for any updates. The first call came from Lydia, asking me to pick up groceries. including milk. I assured her I'd take her shopping over the weekend and suggested we use the time to plan our trip together. Then I pretended I had another call and ended the conversation. The second call was from Ethan, who filled me in. Detective Hale had interviewed the entire crew, both individually and as a group, and everyone's stories matched up. He mentioned that Jack Everett, the floor manager, had given me a strong character reference. Ethan said the detective didn't seem overly suspicious, and I felt a surge of relief. It seemed the pieces were slowly falling into place. After tucking the boys in, I found Lydia lounging on the couch with a glass of wine, looking as if nothing was wrong in the world. I grabbed a cold Foster's, settled into my recliner, and tried to start an honest conversation. But as soon as I mentioned her plan to paint me as the villain, her expression shifted, and she clammed up. Without a word, she downed the rest of her wine and disappeared into the bedroom, making it clear she wasn't interested in hashing things out. Disappointed, I sipped my beer, then decided to check the phone recorder for anything useful. The first call was to her sister, Diana, who already knew about her affair with Dominic and was fully supportive. That didn't shock me. But the next call was more interesting. Lydia called her mom, who had no idea about the affair. Lydia spun a story that Dominic was just a friend of Rachel's and that I was jealous, having supposedly been after Rachel myself for years. She didn't directly accuse me of murder, but her tone implied enough. Then, Lydia tried to replace the cell phone I'd taken, but the company didn't give her much help. She called the DMV to report her license lost and was advised to inform the police. Finally, when she called the bank to request a new credit card, she discovered the account was closed. I had to give her credit. She was thorough. The last call on the machine was to Rachel, who lived nearby but still opted to chat by phone. This one was a goldmine. Lydia mentioned that Dominic's friend Wally was still planning to come in from Detroit, and she intended to lay low until he arrived. That next morning, I got up early with the boys, left the house before Lydia was up, and returned home after lunch. As soon as we walked in, Lydia demanded a grocery run, still carless and now without a license. That evening, while she cooked dinner, I checked the recorder again. Wally had arrived, and as soon as he'd settled in, he called Lydia. Their conversation revealed just how serious he was. He fully bought Lydia's story and was apparently out for revenge, determined to make someone pay. As childhood friends, Wally and Dominic had been close, and now Wally saw himself as Dominic's avenger. He even provided Lydia with his contact information and told her to call him the next day. After that, Lydia called Rachel, sounding happier than I'd heard her in ages. Hearing her so upbeat about this new plan hit hard. I could hardly believe this was the same woman I'd been married to. Her transformation had been sudden and complete, as if our years together meant nothing. I decided I needed space before confronting her again. I headed out, grabbing a burger and using the excuse of mowing the lawn to keep away from her. Later that evening, Lydia's parents showed up unexpectedly to take the boys for a sleepover. I didn't put up a fight, and Grandma Wilcox assured me they'd have them back in time for school the next day. Once they left, I felt a strange sense of relief, one less worry for what I suspected was coming. I couldn't wait to check the phone recorder, but held off until after lunch, heading to Denny's for a bite since I'd skipped breakfast. Lydia didn't say a word about my absence. Back at home, the recorder confirmed what I feared. Lydia and Wally had worked out a plan to avenge Dominic's death. The setup was as ridiculous as it was dangerous. Wally would enter the house through the sliding door off the back deck. Lydia assured him she'd leave it unlocked. If all went smoothly, it would look like a botched burglary, with me as the unfortunate victim of a gunshot. Both Lydia and Rachel were supposed to call 911 right after hearing the gunfire. That's when I realized my life insurance still had Lydia listed as the beneficiary. I made a mental note to change that first thing in the morning. As I left the house, I sarcastically blew Lydia a kiss, and she shot back a middle finger. I had dinner with my parents and, knowing things could escalate, borrowed my dad's snake charmer, a short-barreled 20-gauge shotgun, just in case. When I got home later that night, Lydia was in bed, pretending to read. I checked the answering machine and found a single message from Rachel. She was gleefully boasting about the great time she'd had with Wally earlier and assured Lydia they were both ready for the big plan. After everyone had gone to bed, I prepped for what was coming. I swapped the buckshot in the shotgun shells with rock salt, left over from winter. I didn't intend to kill Wally, but I wanted to make sure he felt the consequences of his actions. After what happened to Dominic, I hoped Wally's heart was a bit more durable. Around midnight, I settled into my recliner, shotgun in hand, and waited. Lydia had promised Wally the back door would be unlocked, so I didn't check it. Didn't want to risk being seen. I tossed the bedclothes around to make it look like I'd been asleep and kept my cell phone nearby. It was well after midnight when I saw movement on the deck. I quickly dialed 911, whispering that there was an intruder in my house and that I feared for my life. I kept the line open, letting the dispatcher hear everything. Moments later, Wally slid open the patio door and stepped inside. I waited until he was fully in, then aimed low and fired the first shot, hitting him in the legs. The blast knocked him backward, and he stumbled against the deck railing, groaning in pain. I fired a second time, this one sending him over the edge, snapping part of the railing as he tumbled below, howling in agony. The rock salt must have burned like fire, and the shotgun blast had left my ears ringing. As I turned on the lights, Lydia came running into the room, screaming, though her words were garbled in the aftermath of the gunfire. I barely paid her any attention, heading toward Wally to assess the damage. That's when I noticed something glinting in his hand. A Ruger .22 automatic pistol, half hidden as he writhed in pain. As I looked down at the silencer lying on the floor beside Wally's pistol, Lydia kept shrieking behind me. I turned, aimed the shotgun in her direction, and she instantly clammed up, backing out of the room in a hurry. Wally was sprawled on the ground, clutching his leg. He'd managed to break his ankle in the fall. Lucky guy. The first police car arrived about 10 minutes later, and I carefully placed the shotgun on the floor to avoid any misunderstandings. I pointed to the still open phone line and explained to the officers that everything was under control. When they asked if anyone else was in the house, I mentioned Lydia was hiding in the bedroom. They brought her into the living room, but despite their best efforts to calm her down, she kept yelling hysterically. A large female officer eventually led her outside to cool off. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Rachel standing among the gathered neighbors, watching the scene unfold. I caught her eye, gave her a mocking grin, and ran my finger across my throat. Her face blanched, and she quickly disappeared into the crowd. As EMTs tended to Wally's injuries, Detective Hale arrived, glancing around before spotting me. He flashed a slight smile, and I couldn't help but give him a wry grin back. The officer brought Lydia back inside to gather her things, and once she was dressed, we all headed down to the police station. I requested that Lydia and I be transported in separate cars, which Hale readily agreed to, letting me ride with him. We didn't speak on the way downtown, though he kept glancing at me with a knowing look. Though Detective Hale and I only spoke for about 30 minutes at the station, they kept me there all night, loading me up on coffee until I couldn't take another drop. Eventually, a police car drove me home as the sun rose, and to my surprise, everything looked just as I'd left it. No yellow tape, no sign of the late-night drama, except for the busted deck railing. The rock salt had left Wally worse for wear, but the glass door was fine. Fixing the railing wouldn't take more than an hour, I figured. Exhausted, I collapsed into bed and didn't wake up until the afternoon. When I finally stumbled into the kitchen, there sat Detective Hale at my table, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper as if he'd been there all along. Rubbing my eyes, I poured myself a tall glass of orange juice and sat across from him, still wondering how he'd even gotten inside. "You're a cool customer, Mr. Collins," he remarked, not looking up from the paper. Not sure if he was testing me, I stayed quiet. Eventually, I said, "Detective Hale, I could use a shower, a shave, and maybe some lunch. I'll treat. Unless that's against police protocol." He smiled, not budging. "Take your time, Nate. I've got all day." As I showered, I pondered what Hale might want from me. He'd seemed unfazed by Lydia's story so far, and I couldn't help but wonder if he had his own reasons for lingering. When we finally sat down to lunch, I ordered us both 2 hefty pulled pork sandwiches. Hale even accepted a beer. We ate in silence until it grew almost comical, and finally he spoke. "You have questions, don't you, Mr. Collins?" I looked up, smirking a little. "Funny. I thought the same about you." Hale flagged down the waiter for another round of beers, settling in as if he had all day. "I spent the whole night grilling you," he said. "Now it's your turn." "All right, first question. Where's my wife?" "She's still in custody," he replied casually. "Charges will be filed this afternoon." I took a deep swig, processing the news. It was a lot to take in, but instead of prying, I leaned back and smirked. Nice to see Lydia's folks rallying around her. "Because I won't be—" "No more questions, Detective Hale. But if you have something to spill, go ahead." He chuckled, finishing his beer. "One thing," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Did you ever overhear or record any conversations between your wife and Mr. Williams?" "You mean Wally?" That got a smirk out of him. "If I did have something like that, would you even want it?" He thought it over. "If things go as I suspect, it may not matter. But if they get sharp lawyers, evidence like that could make things easier." "Right, I get you," I said, nodding. "But I think you've got it covered, tape or no tape." Hale laughed, tapping the table with his finger. "Thanks, Nate. Now let's get you home. Your boys will be back from school soon, and I think they're going to need their dad around." We got back just as Logan and Mason hopped off the school bus. I introduced them to Hale, who answered their eager questions about being a detective and showed them his badge. Then, out of nowhere, Hale asked, "So, who built the tugboat and who assembled the monster truck?" Logan beamed. "I built the truck," he said proudly, while Mason chimed in, "and I did the tugboat. Wanna see?" Hale promised to take a look next time and headed out. But as he left, I was left feeling like he knew more than he let on. He was well aware of the pink paint predicament, and he had the upper hand in all this. That evening, I ordered pizza, and thankfully, the boys didn't ask about their mom's whereabouts. Later, Lydia's father called, tentatively asking if I'd help raise bail money for her release. I declined politely, wondering if he understood just how deep things had gotten. When I asked where she'd be staying, he paused, then reluctantly said she'd be with them. I loaded up Lydia's belongings in the truck and dropped them off without a word. On my way home, I noticed a U-Haul in Rachel's driveway, which was gone by the next morning. Lydia never reached out again, and any updates I got came through the newspaper. There was no drawn-out trial. Lydia pinned everything on Wally, and he returned the favor, claiming it was all her idea. They both took plea deals. Lydia got 3 to 5 years for conspiracy, and Wally received 5 to 10 for attempted homicide. Federal authorities looked into Wally's silencer, but they decided to wait until he finished his state sentence before filing further charges. Hale never ended up needing the tape, and he stopped bringing it up. As for Rachel, she vanished from town without a trace, leaving behind nothing but whispers. One afternoon, my dad came over to retrieve his shotgun, patting it fondly. "Keep it handy, son," he joked with a grin. "You never know when you might need it again." We both laughed, but his words held a strange ring of truth. Lydia served me with divorce papers once her sentence began, and she didn't contest a thing. It was clear she wanted to sever all ties. Since the night I shot Wally, I hadn't seen or spoken to her. I eventually sold the house and moved in with my parents. Balancing work with raising the boys on my own was more than I could handle. Work welcomed me back with an offer to switch to the day shift, but I declined, sticking to the nighttime routine I knew best. I took the boys for regular visits to see their mother at Mooney Women's Prison, but I never went inside. Instead, I stayed in the car, usually for less than an hour, watching through the chain-link fence if the weather was nice. I didn't discuss the visits with the boys and asked them not to share any details, and for a while this arrangement worked. Then one afternoon the phone rang. "Hello, is this Nathaniel Collins?" A woman's voice asked. "Yes, speaking. My name is Isabella Rivera. Detective Marcus Hale suggested I reach out to you. There are some things we need to discuss." I tensed, unsure where this was going. "I'm aware. But why do you need to talk to me? Dominic Santoro was my brother, just when I thought I'd put it all behind me. I'm sorry for your loss, I said, but I don't think I can help you. I ended the call before she could continue. 2 days later, she called back, suggesting we meet. I agreed reluctantly, telling her, Saturday morning at 10 o'clock at the Continental Classics showroom. I'll bring my sons. They like looking at old cars. I didn't know what her intentions were, but I figured a public place and having the boys with me might keep things calm. Not that I was using them as a shield, I just hoped her approach might soften with them around. Still uneasy, I called Detective Hale, who chuckled and told me, just go. Talk to her. Stop worrying. Easy for him to say. He wasn't the one who'd taken her brother down. On Saturday, I pulled up to Continental Classics with Logan and Mason. The place had been revamped, and they were celebrating a grand reopening, complete with a popcorn machine, a hot dog stand, and someone in clown shoes handing out treats. The boys were thrilled, darting between the old cars and freebies. Then I spotted her, Isabella Rivera. She was unmistakable, with her dark hair, olive complexion, and a confident, purposeful stride that showed a mix of determination and restraint. She was striking with a compact, sturdy frame, not quite 5 feet tall, a stark contrast to her towering brother. My unease only grew as she approached, every step a reminder that I had no idea what she truly wanted from me. My tension eased as I noticed a young girl at Isabella's side, a smaller version of her with lighter hair and a gentler frame, likely around 10. It seemed we both found some comfort in our children's presence. As Isabella reached me, she extended her hand. Nathaniel Collins, I presume? I shook her hand, feeling an odd sense of familiarity, like a scene out of an old movie. Her smile was warm, but there was a hint of nervousness in her eyes, which strangely put me more at ease. Thank you for meeting with me, she began, her voice steady, though with an edge of tension. I want to understand the business thoroughly so I can take control and make it work. In the meantime, it's important that you assert yourself. Isabella explained that her kindness in the past had led Dominic and his wife to try and take advantage of her, but that she was determined to approach things differently now. Her tone softened as she recounted their failed attempt, and I chuckled at the irony of it all. Over the next half hour, we discussed the terms of a potential arrangement. Isabella offered better pay and benefits than I had at the factory, along with the flexibility to return to my old job if things didn't work out. Felt like a new beginning, one that I hoped would stick. On the way home, Logan started to look a little queasy, probably from too many hot dogs and sodas, while Mason seemed more interested in chatting with Isabella's daughter, Arya, than in the cars. Unfortunately, Logan didn't make it home without getting sick in the truck, which led to him skipping supper. I started at Continental Classics the following Monday, and just as Isabella predicted, I quickly got the hang of things. Most of the employees, including Grant's cousin, who became my strongest ally, were supportive and eager to make the business thrive. Isabella handed over some key responsibilities, including the task of firing employees who weren't up to par. Surprisingly, I found satisfaction in setting the company's new standards, and my reputation as a no-nonsense manager quickly took hold. Detective Hale stopped by regularly for coffee, and our casual conversations gradually became more open. One day, he shared a bit of his own story. 3 years ago, I was a cop in Philly, he began. Came home one day to find my wife in bed with my supervisor. I lost it, threw her out, and the department told me to quit or be fired. He paused, looking into his coffee. Moved here and found work, but not before making sure her lover lost his job. I didn't press for details, but his story explained a lot about why he'd favored my side. Hale's visits and steady presence felt reassuring, a quiet reminder that I'd come out on the other side of a difficult chapter. The boys agreed to keep my new job under wraps during visits with Lydia. They'd talk casually about the long drive without going into specifics, and while I knew she still saw them, it brought me a small, cold satisfaction. Lydia might not care, but I knew that distance would sting. As the months went on, Isabella and I grew closer, spending more time together both on the job and outside of it. One weekend, the boys insisted on taking her and Arya to Noble's Grove, a small park nearby, and we began spending most weekends together, keeping things simple and close to home due to my living situation with my parents. Despite all the upheaval, a new sense of normalcy was beginning to take shape, one I hadn't expected but found myself welcoming all the same. Our living situations put a damper on anything serious between Isabella and me. While I was definitely interested in a closer relationship, it wasn't practical just yet. I was still living with my parents, and the boys needed stability. Isabella and Arya were sharing a small studio apartment, so space was tight for them too. But as the business grew, Isabella started looking for a house of her own and spent hours online, scrolling through listings and mapping out possibilities. One day, she hinted at her intentions in a way that caught me off guard. "Nate," she said thoughtfully, "I think each boy should have his own room. Better to plan for that now than later, don't you think?" It hit me then, this wasn't just about practical house hunting. Isabella was planning with the future in mind, one that might just include all of us. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep it casual. "A split bedroom plan would be even better. I don't want the boys' rooms too close to the master bedroom." She gave me a small smile, and in that moment, I felt a bond with her that ran deeper than anything I'd ever shared with Lydia. 2 days after finalizing my divorce, Isabella and I celebrated quietly at Red Lobster. The kids, clueless about the significance, happily dug into their meals, but Isabella's warm smile across the table told me she understood. Later, back at her apartment, while the kids watched a movie, she leaned in and kissed me in the kitchen. We both laughed and hugged until Arya walked in, grinning and saying, "It's about time, Mom." The rest of the evening, we kept things platonic, but the promise of what lay ahead was undeniable. The next day, with the kids at school, we took an extended lunch break at her apartment, finally letting down our guards. We barely made it back to work by the end of the day. Over time, these extended lunches became our routine, and Isabella grew more focused on finding a home, especially with the kids in mind. Detective Hale often dropped by the showroom, sometimes admiring the cars. He grew particularly fond of a Studebaker Hawk we had on the lot, previously owned by a local legend, Leonard Blackwood. Isabella offered him a good deal on it, and he practically lit up. But then, out of nowhere, Isabella asked if I'd take her to visit Lydia. "Lydia?" I asked, surprised. Even with our fewer visits, Lydia hadn't seemed to mind. "Why?" She just shrugged. "Closure," she said, her tone simple but thoughtful. Though I didn't fully understand, I agreed, offering to go in with her, but she insisted I just drive. "I don't think you need to be part of this conversation," she said with a calm smile. On a warm fall day, we arrived at Mooney Women's Prison. Visits were held outside, so I parked near the fence and waited. About 10 minutes later, I saw Lydia and Isabella walk into the exercise yard, sitting at a table under the autumn sun. They exchanged pleasantries at first, even smiling like old friends. But soon, Lydia's expression darkened, and she leaned across the table, scowling at Isabella. Isabella, however, remained calm, a cheerful smile never leaving her face. Suddenly, Lydia lunged across the table at her. Guards quickly intervened, dragging my furious ex-wife back inside as she yelled and struggled. As Isabella approached the car, she glanced back with a grin and a shrug. "What was that all about?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. Isabella chuckled softly. "Your ex-wife is quite sensitive," she said with a hint of amusement. And with that, she climbed into the car, still grinning, as if she just won a private battle. As we drove in silence for a while, Isabella turned to face me, straining against her seatbelt, a mischievous glint in her eye. I introduced myself to Lydia, and at first, she actually seemed happy to see me. She thought I was on her side. "I may have misled her a little," she admitted with a grin. I laughed, intrigued. "Oh really? How exactly?" "Well, I told her I'd come from Baltimore seeking revenge. She assumed I meant revenge against you." "And what did you really mean?" I pressed, raising an eyebrow. Her smile deepened. "I meant taking over Dominic's business. My form of retribution. After all, you can still get back at someone who's dead, right?" "Sure. But what made her go so ballistic?" Isabella chuckled. She wanted details. She wanted to know everything. She was asking where, when, how. She was completely fixated on the idea of taking you down. She paused, her voice lowering with amusement. So, I told her I had a long-term plan. She wanted updates and demanded specifics. What did you tell her? I asked, genuinely curious. I told her my grand plan was to work you to death, she said, her smile growing wider. She lost it. Absolutely ballistic. That's it? Just work me to death. I laughed, unable to help the pride I felt for her clever approach. Yep, isn't it funny? I figured she'd get annoyed, but I didn't expect her to go completely unhinged. She wanted revenge right now. We both sat there for a moment, smiling in the comfortable silence. I felt a deep sense of admiration for Isabella. So, I teased, when do you plan to start this devious work-me-to-death scheme? As soon as we get to the next motel. Silly. 2 months later, we married in a simple ceremony in the backyard of the home we'd bought together. Isabella sent Lydia a wedding invitation with a short, playful note attached. Everything is proceeding as planned. Expect him to be exhausted in 40 or 50 years.